door to this little booth was flung open, and there was a man standing there. And his eyes had glasses. He was not too tall, I guess about so. And his blue eyes were just impaling me against the wall. He looked at me with burning hatred, it seemed. And he said, "Get outside and listen." So I slunk out of there, and I went into the body of the theater, and I sat down. And then I heard him over the loudspeaker. And he read the Baroness' prayer. He didn't read it one time. I finally began making little scratches on the pieces of paper I had in my hand. He read it 27 times, and in 27 different ways. And I said to myself, oh my, am I an idiot? Here I am. I'm an actor, and that man who is not an actor is teaching me my craft.
A holy terror, this father of the documentary film, John Grierson. And he didn't just terrify and inspire the actor Lorne Greene. He hammered away for 50 years on 3 generations of filmmakers.
I called him up a couple of times, lamenting that I couldn't write or whatever my particular petty little problems were. And he told me to go to hell and said that it had nothing to do with me, that if any writing inspiration you had came from God, and it was very presumptuous of me to think that I had anything to do with it.
And he says right off the bat that he's not interested in film as an art. He said right away, he's interested simply in its social effect, and he's concerned only with its social, with the film's social impact on people.
If you had, as he said, a dedication to something outside of yourself, you were in business. If you did not have a dedication to something outside of yourself, you'd had it. And you would end up disappearing up your own arsehole or something.
Mr. Minister, Mr. Commissioner, and ladies and gentlemen, I think this is the moment to remember one of the first principles of documentary, and it must be one of the first principles because I wrote it. That it's about today and not about yesterday, and that the only good film is the one you're going to make tomorrow.
His ancestors were lighthouse keepers. He himself spent a lifetime seeing to it that movies were made and used in a way that no man before him had imagined. John Grierson, born in 1898, under a castle in Scotland.
You know, it's a great thing to grow up in the presence of a great castle. And I grew up in the presence of the Battle of Bannockburn, of the Gillies Hill, and half the battles of Scotland. It's quite a privilege.
He was one of 8 children, the son of a Scottish schoolmaster. A family that delighted in argument, that talked of philosophy, religion, and social conditions, that did not believe in orthodox solutions. John Grierson was a bright light in this strong family, and a great deal was expected of him.
I expected, of course, quite good work from Jack Grierson, but I didn't expect just that he would turn out to be so brilliant as he did. He wasn't a showing pupil that talked a great deal in class and in oral work. He left the answering to other people who were more anxious to show that they knew the answers. He knew the answers, but he didn't bother to show that he knew the answers. But if he was asked, he had them all right.
It was a time of massive poverty and social injustice in Glasgow. And as a teenager, Grierson was soon in the thick of things.
You know, my brother was terribly interested in the condition of the Clydesiders at that time, out of the 1920s, when there was a great deal of life in the political movement here in Glasgow. And my mother was a socialist and a suffragette, which at that time was really quite brave.
I came from the Clydeside movement. I came from a time which was
mostly associated, so far as I was concerned, with strikes, long strikes, 9-month strikes. For what? For 75 cents a day. My earliest memories are of helping run soup kitchens to keep the strikers going. I must have been on a soapbox by the time I was 16. It was restive, all right. It was restive to the extent that I was made unemployable for life, if you please. I was put on the blacklist for making a speech at the age of 17.
But young Grierson got some work. During the First World War, he was an ordinary seaman in the Royal Navy, minesweeping in the North Sea.
And after the war, there was the restiveness of the post-war period. And Bertrand Russell was saying, it is necessary, it is absolutely necessary to make peace as exciting as war.
He went back to university. His academic career was brilliant. He graduated with distinction in moral philosophy, but he still didn't quite know what to do with himself. He seriously considered becoming a preacher and studied in that direction. But the 20th century offered too many other possibilities.
They tried to get me to go in for politics at one time. I said, no, I think I'll go round the other way.
The other way was via a fellowship to the University of Chicago. And this was the Chicago of Al Capone, Prohibition, and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
In Chicago, well, I lived in a place called Ontario Street, and next door to me was a flower shop, and in that flower shop one day, Diana Banyan of the North Side Gang, they put him against the wall and they mowed him down among the flowers of his flower shop. That was a fellow I knew.
Another fellow he came to know was the American journalist Walter Lippmann.
And the question posed by Walter Lippmann was this. Can the old systems, or the old outlooks on education, really comprehend this modern society? In other words, they were based on information. Your good citizen had to know about the subject if he had to make a judgment on it. And he says, how can people know everything about everything all the time in the modern world? So we rather wondered where we could think of an answer to his question, where we could find tools fit for this modern comprehension, for the comprehension of the modern thing. Well, at first I was foolish, but at first I thought it was the development of the press. And I was particularly interested, not in the nice good press like the New York Times. I was interested in the Hearstian press. I was interested in the yellow press because of one thing. In its headline it said, somebody does something to somebody, or something happens to something. Always was this action factor. And the idea it did present was that if you dramatize things, if you brought things into dramatic form, if you brought them alive, as distinct from gave information, you might find a way of illumining the modern world.
He would call on the newspaper editor, and he would give the editor a chance to size him up. And then he'd say, well, I'm going to be around here for 10 days. Why don't you let me be a volunteer in writing editorials? So in this way, he got into the editorial conferences in these newspapers, and he learned at first hand what they were doing, or attempting to do, in influencing public opinion.
Grierson was soon in Hollywood, investigating a new medium of communication. Millions were going to the movies, and Grierson was fascinated by the possibilities.
The Americans have been making great films for just since about 1915. Take the moving of the Westerns into the great epics, the great epic Westerns. Take the whole story of Hollywood, and you've got a tremendous story of technical development of the cinema as a language for all the world to enjoy. Its greatest achievement was to populate the arts with common people. In other words, it introduced the idea of social democracy to the whole wide world.
He was excited by Hollywood. And he was excited by the work of the great Russian director Eisenstein. He was one of the early film critics, one of the first intellectuals to take film seriously.
in the work of Eisenstein, you have a person who reacted to all the forces of his time and of our time. That's to say, he reacted to the new industrial world, the great new technological world. He wanted in his art to reflect the colossal resources of this industrial world. He wanted the cinema in its power over movement to reflect the movement of great masses of industrial forces.
Another influence was the work of the American filmmaker Robert Flaherty, who took his cameras on location.
I was fascinated by what Flaherty had done in that Canadian film called Nanook of the North. Well, he'd gone up there, you see, and he'd thrown the whole Hollywood formula away. He had said, I'm not taking a synthetic story to Labrador. What is the real drama of life here? Well, it's the Eskimo fighting for food, fighting for food in wild weather. And just in that simple illumination of the Eskimos' life, he sort of suggested something. And I think documentaries as we know it today came from following that out.
Flaherty and Grierson became fast friends, but Flaherty worked the far corners of the world with primitive societies. Grierson would work other ground.
I once said to him, it's all right, Bob, you go and do the savages at the ends of the earth, and I'll do the savages in Birmingham. But nonetheless, it was a breakaway in theory because his manner, as you know, was idyllic, and the idyllic form won't certainly comprehend this very unidyllic world. We have a very exciting world, but still, certainly it's not often idyllic.
Grierson returned to England in 1927. He had decided where to direct his vast energies. He would not write about movies, he would make them. There was no name for the type of film he wanted to make, so he invented one. He called it the documentary film, and took his ideas not to movie studios, but to a civil servant in a small government department.
I took to him at first sight. He poured out his ideas with so much enthusiasm and so much conviction. He was brimful of cinema's unexplored possibilities. Films could and should, he urged, be employed to bring alive, with a penetrating vividness that should touch the imaginations of us all, the lives and the daily work of ordinary men and women in the new world that was growing up around us.
And so John Grierson was a civil servant and a movie director, operating out of a one-room flat, editing on a kitchen table with a movie projector in the lavatory. He often slept amongst his highly explosive nitrate film, and every morning, it was said, he shot from the bed like a threatened gangster, ready to take on the world. He immediately demonstrated his shrewdness in dealing with the bureaucracy. He needed money. The man in charge of the money was an expert on herring. Grierson proposed a film on the herring fisheries, and it was approved.
Well, I started with a film called Drifters, which was a thing in which I got a chance to put the working class on the screen for the first time on the record of England. Let it be noted that it took all that time to get a working man on the screen as other than a comic figure.
Drifters, a silent film made in 1929, was a hit with the audience and had a profound influence on filmmakers in Europe and the world. Here indeed was a new way of using film. But John Grierson actually directed just one more film himself and then decided to focus his energies on building the new documentary movement.
He gave up the wonderful delight of directing a film himself, and nothing is more pleasurable, because he realized that if he could create a little group, a little unit round him, to create films under his guidance of it, a word in producership, under his guidance, he, in the long run, would be doing something more worthwhile for this democratic ideal, which I mentioned earlier, than if he went on making one picture at a time.
He stopped his work and he became an organizer of work for others. He really worked so that the other people could make their films. And that was wonderful from this man who also fought against bureaucracy. He got the money for the people. The people could, from their documentary work, they could live. We in Europe, we couldn't even live of our documentary film. We had to make other publicity films to live, you know.
The basic group were young men down from the universities. They were mostly upper middle class people. None of them conventional upper middle class, all in rebellion, all looking for some way to change things, to strike back, to make something happen in their day and their time. Not full-time revolutionaries, but artists is the best sense of the word.
It was his argument that if one could see into ordinary things with sufficient perception, one could make them as dramatic and exciting as all the pasteboard excitements of Hollywood. And this is really what he set out to do. And the most striking instance that I can remember was that he turned me on to make a film about airplane engines, and it does have a whole series of very close and personal studies of men doing various jobs in the fitting shops and so forth. When we came to show the rough cut of Aero Engine to the officials at the Air Ministry, they were really offended at the close, intimate treatment of the workers in the foundry and so on, and asked if we could take the close-ups out. I think they felt their kind of middle-class privilege had been invaded, and they were very troubled at this.
With all the documentaries of television nowadays, it's very hard to understand that we were putting the British working man, the backbone of the country, onto the screen. Before that, he was the comic relief in these ghastly British films, you see? Ghastly films that always started with the butler and the maid, and then the funny gardener or the funny taxi driver. We knocked all that down. And for that, by the establishment, we were looked upon as subversive.
He was not anxious and eager to draw conclusions from the film, but I think he felt that if you could give people the facts and then guide them perhaps a little in the direction of the right conclusion, then you would have a socially valuable outcome, which you could call political. It could be called political if anybody wanted to use the word, but it really was an advanced form of social education.
The films were being made, but now they had to reach the people. Why just movie theaters? Why not projectors in schools, museums, even railway stations?
And the very first one we had, I think, at Victoria Station. And it was up in a box. And people on outside the platforms could look up and see it. And I went along with John to see how it was working. And it made these rude noises and stopped. He rushed around the back and ran up a little ladder. I didn't know him awfully well then, because as I watched him go up the ladder, I could see a bare place in his trousers, and I could see his behind.
Grierson was everywhere, pushing the movement in every direction. A former film critic himself, he knew the value of publicity.
And in came this figure of fire and energy, and rather frightening in appearance, because at that time, Grierson was wearing a long black waterproof and a broad-brimmed black hat, and he seemed to have come straight out of the streets of Chicago in this frightening manner that he had. I was one of perhaps 6 or 7 critics, and he kept constantly in touch with us throughout the country, so that when a new film came along, he would let us know about it, and we would write about it eventually. And the documentary idea, therefore, grew not only because of the films themselves, but because the ideas implied in the films were introduced to a wide public throughout the country.
He was attracting an audience. He was attracting other artists. Sound had come to film, but most of it was sentimental slush. Grierson brought in the sound expert Cavalcanti, composers like Benjamin Brittain, poets like Auden. They created a new kind of sound. Nobody had heard anything quite like it before.
The miner works in a cramped position.
Comprehended. The
Often he has scarcely room to swing his pick. He works along the sea, hewing out the coal. His average output is 2,200 weights per shift.
Letters of thanks, letters from banks, letters of joy from the girl and the boy, receipted bills and invitations to inspect new stock or to visit relations, and applications for situations and timid lovers, declarations and gossip from all the nations, news circumstantial, news financial, letters with holiday snaps to enlarge in, letters with faces scrawled in the margin, letters from uncles, cousins and aunts, letters to Scotland from the south of France, letters of condolence to Highlands and Lowlands, notes from overseas to Hebrides, written on paper of every hue, the pink, the violet, the white and the blue, the catty, the boring, adoring, the cold and official, all the hearts outpouring, clever, stupid, short and long, the typed and the printed and spelt all wrong.
And Grierson suddenly said, stop. This is about as far as we can go along this line. There are 4.5 million unemployed in Britain. There are a number of problems on the horizon, including a coming world war. Let us stop looking at the beautiful sunsets. Let us try and find some beautiful sunrises, and if not, let us issue a series of warnings. And in order to do this, we must shed our halos and our pretensions and get down to the brass tacks. And this was absolutely fantastic. If you can imagine housing problems, these were sine verite interviews with people inside tiny little slum rooms full of rats and water running down the wall.
My recollection is that Grierson, thinking about it, said quite casually, well, just shove the camera at them. And we stood the people up in front of the cameras and the cameras in front of the people. We asked them questions and they spoke. God help us, we started the interview film from which the world has never entirely recovered.
One night I was at bed and I said, Mike, I said, the old gentleman's up here again, I said. So he said, oh, nonsense. He said, you're crackers.
Rarely,
So
even
I
to
said,
this
no,
day, does one see more natural speech than Mrs. Ackroyd describing how she got rid of the rats.
And you see him on the bedstead like that, see, looking at him. He throwed the clothes over the top. Of course, he got away again.
This is the first use of cinema verite, the candid camera, and it was accomplished despite the fact the simplest sequence required tons of massive equipment. Revolutionary in the 1930s, 20 years ahead of its time.
Jumped up, he jobbed him with the broom, and he got away from there, he went over on the sideboard, jobbed him again with the broom, broke the broom, and then he knocked him down on the ground. Of course, the screams of him was terrible. So he had to jump on him, and then he picked him up and killed him.
In 1938, on the advice of Ross MacLean, a young Canadian diplomat in London, Grierson was invited to Canada to counsel the government on the use of film. There soon developed a curious rapport between the dynamic Grierson and the outwardly phlegmatic and colorless Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King.
Mackenzie King was a great film fan, actually. He had a great passion for the cinema, and it was he, probably more than anyone else, who, in the end, in terms of politics, was the main support of the National Film Board throughout the war.
Well, he was in from the start, and it was his decision that to back me and let the others go hang. It meant, of course, going against all kinds of advices from deputy ministers who wanted to save their own little units, from very powerful ministers. But no, he decided to back his fellow Scotsman. There was that kind of relationship from the beginning, and from the outset he came down and said, what Grierson says goes, and the rest go hang. And of course I was in a position that very few people ever are in, where the Prime Minister has really said it's his word, and it goes. By the grace of God, old Mackenzie King really thought my eyes were blue. It's very important in life to get Prime Ministers who suffer from illusions. And every time you hear Mackenzie King denounced or derogated in any way because he was half crazy for love of his mother and for the his efforts to get in touch with his mother in the far fields of the beyond. Take it from me, that's the kind of guy I like.
Mackenzie King was concerned with the pervasive influence of American magazines, the radio, and movies. He wanted something Canadian on the screens of his nation. The Nazis in Germany were using film brilliantly to spread their message. Canada, too, would use the immense power of film. The King government created the National Film Board and put Grierson in charge.
The Film Board was a deliberate creation to do a deliberate work. The work could be written out in the form of an act of Parliament and was. It was there to bring Canada alive to itself and to the rest of the world. It was there to declare the excellences of Canada to Canadians and to the rest of the world. It was there to evoke the strengths of Canada, the imagination of Canadians in respect of creating their present and their future.
Grierson set up shop in an old sawmill on the Ottawa River. Now he had to fill it. There were very few filmmakers in the country. Grierson had to create a new breed.
There was this nationalist feeling already ready to be expressed through people like yourself, or youngsters who came into the film board, already fired with the idea of serving Canada and serving the image of Canada in an imaginative form and in a creative way. And when I've heard you describe my manning of the film board as a rather crazy job of picking all the nuts around. No, I didn't pick nuts. I went after the people who were talking nationalism in Canada, who had this bug. And you'll find that if you look back on all the youngsters I brought in, including yourself, you all had the common bug of being very Canadian and very aware of it and not going to put up with any nonsense anymore from the English Raj and what it represented.
Within months, Canada was at war with Germany. Suddenly, the Film Board had a vastly expanded role to play. It would be a primary propaganda tool in the war effort. Overnight, Canadian school teachers, painters, and poets became movie directors. And Grierson imported experienced foreigners, primarily Englishmen, to help build his propaganda machine.
We were all learning as we went along. Here we were trying to make a monthly series of two-reelers to feed into about 7,000 or 8,000 cinemas on really very small resources and very small budgets.
At that time, Grierson was custodian of enemy property as far as film was concerned. The Germans industriously put newsreel footage on ships, presumably neutral ships for New York, and the British equally industriously took it all off when the ship stopped at Bermuda and passed it on to Grierson.
Unermüdlich greift die Luftwaffe in das gewaltige Ringen ein. Durch zielsichere Schüsse unserer Schlachtflieger werden feindliche Nachschubfahrzeuge und Panzer vernichtet.
The easy thing was the material, because at that time there were vast resources of film material being shot all over the world, and it was an absolutely Tolstoyan panorama of the world in conflict.
The Straits of Dover, no wider than the St. Lawrence, no wider than the Mississippi. On one side, the greatest machine of conquest of all time. On the other, the white ramparts of Britain. On this narrow strip of water, the eyes of the whole British Commonwealth are fixed. World history may soon be shaped here. Around this island fortress of Britain, they have built a wall of steel. Night and day, the watching eyes gaze seaward. None can say when the hour of invasion may come, but come, they believe it will.
The mood of the picture was set by the picture itself. The tone of it was set by the film. And it was my job to see to it that my mood emphasized the mood of the film.
Another German city has been blasted by the RAF Bomber Command.
Most of the films were hard-hitting, tough, strong, and that was the purpose, I think, to create a feeling of great strength in the country, a strength which was indomitable, unflappable, and had to be victorious.
Sure, I'm proud. Can't you tell? This is the latest fashion for Mademoiselle. I'm the proudest girl in the world. There are lots of reasons to why I'm in. With every soldier I'm out to win. We're out to build a shoulder road into Berlin. That's why I'm proud.
Grierson even enlisted the delicate talents of Norman McLaren, whose concept of drawing picture and sound directly on film had never been done before. McLaren rapidly became internationally famous, and Grierson gave him a chance to work his talents freely. But still he was tough on artistic pretension. "I can only afford one artist," he said. And he was only partly kidding.
All of us youngsters at the film board, purely as a matter of affectation, were self-appointed eccentrics, and we dressed eccentrically, and we sat around and looked at old films. And Grierson called a couple of us in one day, and he said, "Get out there and tell those guys that first they have to become filmmakers. First they have to know their business. And then when they have become people in their own right and authorities in their field, then they can develop eccentricities. In the meantime, let them work." Because the great problem is that now, when their eccentricities are merely vanities, what they're really doing is getting in the way of our work, because we are getting a reputation at the film board for being eccentrics instead of getting a reputation as filmmakers, as people of some consequence in this community and people who are contributing something to our society.
Oh, he could be very difficult. He expected a great deal from everyone, and he liked his own way. And I remember there was a time when we seldom met in his office without pounding the desk at each other. But he gave as much as he demanded, and we had a great affection for him because we knew that he made it possible for us to do the kind of work we wanted to do. What perhaps we didn't always realize, you know, the boss is always wrong. What we may not have realized was the constant battles he was fighting for us behind the scenes.
John Grierson was moving up and down the corridors of power and influence, preaching the gospel of film, soothing angry bureaucrats, convincing reluctant cabinet ministers. Art, he told them, was not a mirror, but a hammer. Back and forth he went across the country, building a huge distribution network from nothing. Grierson had another job, director of Canada's Wartime Information Board, and he had to deal with Dieppe.
And word had come through that this was a Canadian show, and the Canadians, who had waited very patiently for a little news about their boys overseas, were dying to hear something, and hear something good about their troops. And so preparations had been made for tremendous spreads in the newspaper. And it was to be film, they were going to get film in, radio was going to devote a lot of time to it, and so on. And that evening, Grierson sat with a little squawk box, a little shortwave radio. And across this shortwave thing, suddenly came clearly the voice of the German propaganda machine. They were telling about this commando raid. And it was an entirely different story that had come through official dispatches. And Grierson sat and listened to 15 minutes of this blatant war propaganda. And he got up from his seat and said, you know what? They're telling the truth. Those fellows are telling the truth. And he had the courage to go to the phone, cancel all of the preparations for the great big story, and say, play it down. And sure enough, by next morning, it turned out to be a terrible tragedy.
Ottawa, where the Prime Minister took a streetcar to work, was a place where Grierson could get things done in a hurry. His wife, Margaret, was the quiet center of his storm.
Well, I suppose there you feel you are in touch with the whole country and with the government. And it's possible to talk to people, isn't it? I mean, there weren't so many committees. He'd go to the Rideau Club and meet some of a certain kind, you know, well-established, good civil servants. And then in the cafeteria, we would meet all the young people, you know, the Prime Minister's secretaries and so on, as they were then. Jack Pickersgill.
He broke the furious tempo, fishing in the Gatineau Hills, advising his disciples on marriage, expounding on the relative merits of Scotch whiskies, jockeys, football players, and philosophers.
Oh, well, this was the great thing, too. I mean, his house was more or less open on the Saturdays and Sundays, and some of us who were bolder and not afraid of his vigor used to turn up at his house on a Saturday afternoon, and his marvelous wife, Margaret, somehow always managed to produce a ham, and there was always whiskey and drink and in the place, and the odd cabinet minister of the Canadian government would turn up. And there were we, sort of young kids of 23 and 24, sort of hobnobbing with cabinet ministers of 40 and 45 who were running the country in the middle of war.
The war was coming to a close. It would soon be time again to make peace as exciting as war. But Grierson's patience with Canadian bureaucrats was wearing thin. He had resigned as head of the National Film Board, but was still in Canada when a startling event clouded his departure. A Russian spy ring was exposed in Ottawa, and several Canadians were convicted of espionage. There was a passing reference to Grierson in one of the Russian secret documents. He was called on to testify before a secret tribunal. There was not a shred of evidence that he was in any way implicated. However, he was not now encouraged to stay on in Canada. The government didn't even give him a farewell party. He went to New York, hoping to bring serious documentaries into the American movie theaters. But his stay was short-lived.
I went to the room that he told me about, and I knocked on the door and no answer, and a moment later a door opened down the hall on the other side, and John stuck his head out and he said, "Come on in here." Well, this was a mystifying thing indeed, and then when I got in and talked to him, he said, "We'll have to talk very low because I'm afraid that I'm being bugged or I'm being surveyed."
He was indeed being surveyed. The Cold War had started, and there was a morbid fear of communism in America. It was a time of witch hunts, and the mere fact that Grierson's name had been innocently dropped in an obscure Russian communique was enough. His work permit was lifted, and he was never again allowed to work in the United States. The next stop was Paris. UNESCO was being organized, and Grierson was called on to plan mass communications for the world. European documentary filmmakers flocked to his colors.
And, you know, it was tremendously impressive to see this group, this absolute solidarity of the documentary people, because they come from everywhere. You know, they came over at their own expense, and there they were, behind Jack, completely lined up. And if he wanted somebody, or somebody at Soho Square would come over on the next plane, you know, and so forth.
Two-thirds of the world were lacking in all the facilities. They were lacking in trained personnel, trained staff, and so on. And so Grierson said, for God's sake, let's forget about all the political business of freedom of information and censorship. If we start discussing those, if we start to try to do anything in those fields, we'll simply divide the organization right down the middle, let's get on with the immediate job was the only thing that makes sense. There's no sense in the phrase freedom of information or free flow for people who've got no transmitters, who've got no receivers, who've got no film directors, who've got no newspapers, who've got none of these things.
But Grierson couldn't cope with the red tape created by a bureaucracy run by every country in the world. Within a year, he quit. His impact, however, was felt everywhere. In Italy, for example, where Roberto Rossellini had pioneered a new school of social realism in the cinema.
Grierson, he has the genius to identify what they were the needs and to organize a system in which to develop the thought to satisfy those needs. So that's the reason why Grierson is a great model for me. He was very open. He was very, very open. You know, a man of that stature, he was not there and, you know, imposing himself. He was there full of curiosity, searching for new things. And that's the reason why the dialogue was very easy with him.
In the early 50s, he returned to work in England. He decided to try and introduce the social realism of his documentaries into the British dramatic feature film. These were low-budget films, using new actors, new writers, new directors.
Working on a script, for instance, you would have a very difficult time indeed. I mean, he would challenge you all the way down the line, and there'd be many evenings when you'd go home and say, I'm not going to work with this man. I was going to say something else again, you know. And, you know, then a few hours later you begin to see something of what he was trying to do, and, you know, you'd rewrite the thing.
Some of his films were successful, but the low-budget feature, like so many of Grierson's concepts, was years ahead of its time. They didn't make enough money, and Grierson was again looking for work. He got it at Scottish Television, run by the Canadian Roy Thompson. He was the host of This Wonderful World, one of the longest-running shows in British broadcasting history. Its popularity was based partly on the force of his own personality and partly on the excellence of the documentary films he showed.
He seemed to get these films from all over the world. He had a great connection, apparently, behind the Iron Curtain, which was an Iron Curtain in those initial days. He could seem to go to these other countries and get film that I'm sure nobody else could have gotten.
And that's all for tonight. My assistant Henson, my director Sutherland, and I bid you all in the Highlands and the Lowlands and over the border a very good night.
He used This Wonderful World program almost as a pulpit to preach and illuminate, and this was very much his attitude. And you could see it in his contact with the people in the street, around the Theatre Royal, the points policemen, the girls on the telephone switchboard, the people in the shops. They'd all say, "Oh, doctor, I saw that marvelous film of the goats jumping down the mountainside," you see, and things like that. And this pleased him enormously. But there were other things where he would try and introduce a film on Rubens, the painter, and he would show a piece of World Cup football and explain Rubens to the Glaswegian audience in terms of how Rubens played the corners of the rectangle of the canvas the way the players played the corners of the rectangle of green of the football field. And after that program, there was a man stopped him in the street and said, "You know, Doc," he said, "that was fucking poetry," he said.
If you took a taxi with Grierson, they would say, "Yes, Mr. Wonderful World." They had seen him. They couldn't fail to recognize those piercing eyes. They knew him. And he talked to them. He talked to everybody. It was absolutely a pain to go into Soho shopping with him. You never got anything done. I couldn't get back in time for lunch. Then we'd found out what they liked in the last program, what they didn't like.
However, Grierson had his own doubts about this new television medium.
There are limitations to this very, very good thing, the intimacy, the théâtre intime, very intime of television. There are limitations, and the limitation is the fact that you get cozy. And the people themselves like television to be cozy. And they don't like to be hurt, and when you show brutal things on television, they have no effect. They haven't the effect you think. McLuhan thinks there's a great effect from this television, but I beg you to believe it is He says a massage. Yes, it's a massage, that medium that puts you to sleep. It doesn't brace you. It puts you to sleep, and the people want to be put to sleep, and they object to anything that revolts their infinite comfort. It is a thing of the home and not an explosion in the home. It's a home, a domestic, an instrument of domestic ease.
Grierson approached an old protege, Sidney Newman, by then a senior executive at the BBC. He wanted the big British network to pick up his show. Newman tried to help.
And I did. I brought it to a very senior person. And I said, you know Grierson? He said, yes, yes, I know Grierson. And I said, well, you know this program? He said, yes, yes, I know this program. And I said, well, goddamn it, I think that the BBC should be doing it. I mean, Grierson is a fantastic guy. He brings these little revelations of truth about these cinematic experiments and notions around the world. I think it should be part of the BBC. He said, well, he said, Sidney, who cares about Grierson nowadays? He said, this was a wonderful guy 20 years ago, but he said, no one in England gives really a damn now today.
John Grierson was created a commander of the British Empire, an honorary doctor of laws, and to all intents and purposes, a has-been. He was very nearly stone broke. The force and influence of the man appeared to be spent. He'd never worked anywhere long enough to earn a pension. In 1964, he was invited to the 25th anniversary of his creation, the National Film Board of Canada.
Congratulations on your speech, I must say. Very nice.
It was the shortest. I thought I would at least get a little applause for the shortness of it.
It was an isolated tribute. No Canadian government or university had ever honored his massive contribution to the country.
I've been long gone.
Old friends and employees had to put up money privately for an earlier tour of Canada.
They actually recognized me after 25 years.
A curious relic. Why? Perhaps because Grierson was a radical,
You're a littler man than I thought.
but not a revolutionary. He had always insisted on working within the system, with ideas that were ahead of their time, with programs launched before there was the machinery to handle them.
Let me get a drink and then we'll go. Come on.
His continuing battle against the inevitable frustrations seemed to have finally broken his spirit.
You put a lot of gin in a glass of water, huh?
The NFB had grown from a sawmill into the biggest documentary film studio in the Western world. It appeared that this institution and other studios that had been modeled after it in a half-dozen countries in the world were all that was left of Grierson. In 1968, Grierson was invited to lecture at McGill University. It may have saved his life. He had been critically ill and had been told that if he didn't give up drinking, he'd be dead in 2 months. He arrived in Montreal a teetotaler and never took another drink in his life. He started lecturing as a minor legendary figure with 8 students. Curiosity brought them at first, and then excitement. And he was soon lecturing to 800 students at a crack.
When he came into that lecture hall with like 800 people, I mean, he had to get them right off, and he knew it was an audience. Like, the whole thing about putting your feet down. I mean, people flop all over these lecture halls, and he'd come in and, you know, go on for a few minutes and then spot someone who either had a hat on, who was peeling an orange, or who had his feet up, and he'd say, "Get your feet down," you know.
He was very excited that there was a revolution taking place on campus, and he wanted to get to the root of what it was all about and find out what students had in common that they were all fighting for. In the end, he was very disappointed because he found that no one was working together towards a common idea. And he said, you've got to be organized if you want to have a revolution. So the research that he began to do turned into pep talks.
His lecture halls echoed with furious debate between the master and his students.
If you were going to make a movie about those recent events in Montreal...
I'm not going to make a movie about the recent events. I've made a movie for many years, and I'm not going to make another one, period.
Well, you've got to teach me how to make one, okay?
I will not teach you how to do it.
You teach yourself how to make movies the same way as I did.
What are you going to say about those events to whom? Now, what do you consider significant about
What are you getting me into? Am I a film producer now, or am I Monsieur Trudeau, or what? What position of the argument am I occupying?
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at. You see, because you said that
Are you heckling me for something I've said? Well, then I welcome you. What did I say that you disagree with?
Actually, I'm trying to get a grip on what you said.
Well, you're trying to get a grip on yourself, my friend.
And always there was that old curiosity. When he saw somebody making a movie, he had to find out what it was all about.
Tell me, the editing of this must be awful, is it?
New lightweight equipment and super-sensitive film stock had made it possible for almost anybody to make movies.
It's fascinating.
Grierson, an elitist, was at first skeptical.
Just think of the editing as, you know, a fearful burden, isn't it?
It's interesting.
But the subject isn't good enough, you know?
Oh, yes.
No, there's nothing here.
He'd been away a long time, but as soon as he saw the possibilities, he became a brilliant analyst of the new cinema.
This is just a lot of friendliness, and you can't make a picture out of just friendliness, you know. You can make a nice thing, but you can't make a picture out of it.
He, although I'm sure was very much aware of what was going on the technological side, was not interested in that. I think he wasn't as interested in gimmicks and gadgets, although he knew the significance of a new camera or a new gauge in tape or film, but was basically interested in what is it all going to be for? What are we going to do with it? What are we doing with it at the moment? This I found kind of refreshing.
He wanted people who were going to teach. He wanted people who were going to be politicians. He wanted activists. He didn't want to have anything to do with the so-called artists whatsoever. And he wouldn't hear it mentioned. Someone would say, "Well, what about you know, art, children's art?" And, God.
Grierson was again a man in demand, called to India on a roving commission to push the principles of birth control. Here was a chance to put the new technology to work, gadgets like the cassette tape recorder.
I believe that the first great mass medium in the world is conversation, word of mouth. And it's about time somebody reminded that, because it's by word of mouth that all values are exchanged, all loyalties are exchanged, all political loyalties in particular are created.
He was full of ideas for the use of film for our family planning movement, which has to reach such different types of people, men and women, not only in the towns, but in more than 500,000 villages.
He could still persuade prime ministers, but he was more interested in reaching the teachers in the villages.
We might be able to decentralize communication in a very, very vast way in India, because so much of the propaganda is a giving of orders in a bullying manner from us to you. This won't do. We've got to think of communications as involving, certainly in family planning, a belief in the future, but a belief in the future not imposed from the top, but assumed from the bottom, so that the leaders of the villages are themselves the forefront of the whole exercise in persuasion.
Grierson had no children of his own, but he felt that they should be taken as seriously as anyone else.
You have in India a very odd thing in your children, which I find fascinating, and I've never seen it before. They put up their little hands in front of their eyes with a great gesture and pretense of shyness, but if you look at their cunning little eyes, you'll realize there's another reality behind. So I believe this country may be, as it is, a very shy and manly country, but I wouldn't trust it too much to be other than ingenious also.
He was now past 70 and riding as hard as ever, firing off opinions to new students and old school teachers.
Then he says, "You yourself, what did you do but create a sort of snobbery round constitutional history, which was bound to drive your innocence to Machiavelli and the consideration of power and the nature of propaganda, and thereby myth-making itself? I am your witness."
Education is the master medium of all media. And of course, when it takes over, as I hope it will take over,
Because I want the real professional communicators to be the teachers and the givers of law and the givers, the people who can address the people properly, dramatically or otherwise. But it leaves you with the thought that the most important thing in this world and the one priority is who chooses the teachers. Who chooses the teachers of the teachers. If you ask me what quarter I would want to seek power in another existence, I would say I would want to be the guy that chose the principles of the universities exclusively.
At 73, his belongings were scattered across 3 continents. When suddenly he gathered things up and returned to that center of his storm, Margaret, and his home, Tog Hill, in England. He had learned that he was dying of cancer. He did not go quietly. He surrounded himself with television and radio sets, newspapers and books. He died dictating into a tape recorder.
I've spent a wandering life, and the paradox of getting around is that you hold closer in the mind to where you come from. It is your first and original power of attorney. No, your national affections will not stray much, and distance will lend enchantment, and all the dreamers will behold their Hebrides. But as you wander, as you come up against other horizons, other peoples, other conditions of life, you do find yourself examining more and more the attitudes to life your country gave you.
As John Grierson once said, all things are beautiful, as long as you've got them in the right order.